had to let it happen. I had to change. Couldn't stay all my life down at heel, looking out of the window, staying out of the sun. So I chose freedom. I know I look like kind of a disaster, and I sound like kind of a disaster. It turns out that getting completely wasted with a bunch of queer folk punks and then taking a dip in a chlorinated pool, that's not going to be the best for your sinuses. At least I got this dope hat to celebrate. Happy end of Pride Month, I guess. I guess that was a good way to ring it out, and I decided, if you look as good as I do, you really don't need to worry about being a mess, do you? Otherwise, hello everyone, my name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them in my humble opinion. And in my humble opinion, though I can certainly understand the various reasons that it was just close to 2 months ago that Hurry Up Tomorrow, the collaboration between indie auteur Trey Edward Schultz and the pop act Abel The Weeknd Tesfaye, was greeted by a virtually unanimous chorus of boos from both general audiences and mainstream critics who wrote it off as the most hollow kind of cinematic vanity project. As I addressed in my very review of Hurry Up Tomorrow, where I went perhaps even further than many of my much more accredited contemporaries in terms of pinning down what made that film not merely a pretentious feeling, but very much a disturbing cinematic experience, as though even as far as the film goes in terms of casting Tesfaye as this fictionalized version of himself who is perhaps not the worst kind, but ranks nonetheless highly among the sort of egomaniacal and pathetic creeps and lowlifes who are able to marshal the powers of both pop music and now middlebrow art house adjacent commercial cinema to add a patina of romantic grandeur to the sort of woman manipulating, self-victimizing male anti-heroes whose pathologies are practically betrayed by the very art they're making to not be nearly so complex or worthy of too much serious exploration. As someone who did ultimately give Hurry Up Tomorrow a positive review because I nonetheless found it to be a disturbing and thus compelling, if often troublesomely unintentional seeming portrait of a pathetic lowlife creep. As someone who took that oppositional stance, in my humble opinion, Hurry Up Tomorrow, for all its clearly egomaniacal and vain qualities, it is exactly the sort of work of popular cinema that is the most likely to spark the particular ire of both mainstream film critics and popular audiences, because it still takes risks, because it is still ultimately a creative and artistic challenge to the audience. And however much you think a work like that succeeds or fails on its own merits, right now, at least for me personally, Hurry Up Tomorrow is still ranking among my favorite cinematic experiences of the year. It is almost impossible to stress that a project like that is almost bound to catch a lot of flack for being a so-called vanity project, precisely because, even as a vanity project, in my opinion, it is still quite exceptional as a work of popular art and mainstream commercial cinema. Whereas I gotta be willing to take the same oppositional energy and stress that, looking back to just this weekend's major new film releases, it is a movie like F1 the Movie, a sports drama set in the world of Formula One racing and officially supported by the FIA governing body itself, produced by and starring Brad Pitt as not so much a has-been as a never-was race car driver who is still called out of ignominy by one of his old rivals to try to help the latter revitalize his failing independent Formula One team. This is the sort of movie that, because it is at a baseline such a mediocre and formulaic example of the sports drama itself, because it takes basically no creative risks, and because, based on its own low standards of achievement, practically receives the exact opposite of what Hurry Up Tomorrow received, which is basically a nearly universal, lukewarm to positive critical appraisal, despite the fact that, in my estimation, in addition to being such a broadly mediocre film, It is a movie like F1 that is far more obsequiously emblematic of a truly baffling and navel-gazing vanity project. Now, obviously, Brad Pitt didn't write or direct F1. Those duties go to screenwriter Aaron Kruger and director Joseph Kosinski, respectively, that pair having previously worked on the Smash Legacy sequel hit Top Gun Maverick starring Tom Cruise, and besides all of those individuals' connections to producer Jerry Bruckheimer, who also lends his executive credits to this F1 film, it seems logical why Kruger and Kaczynski would be seen as such a good fit to this new production that, like Maverick before it, is patterned on the formula of some old salty dog that is called in to revive a failing program, and by his own brash example teach some young punk, in this case Damson Idris, as the Formula One team's lead driver, to not be so boxed in by the ironic limitations of their own elite qualifications and standards, but to push further and challenge themselves more to win by any cost, even if it threatens their popularity or individual reputations. Yes, F1 is more or less a beat-for-beat retread of Top Gun Maverick for Kruger and Kaczynski, and one could hardly blame them for sticking to such a safe, dramatic territory, even when that in and of itself kind of defeats the very point that the film is ostensibly trying to make about how you need to bend the rules to achieve something truly extraordinary, that you can't just rely on all this money and technology and regimen to get you to those thresholds of greatness that you want. But I'm not above a run-of-the-mill sports drama as long as it's at least a finely tuned sports drama, or at least one well-suited to whoever are the performers around whom you're fashioning this whole enterprise. And there's no way that F1 is ever going to escape the sense, from the beginning at least for me, that it almost comes off as Pitt as another of these elder leading men of Hollywood, someone who started out as practically centrally cast teen heartthrob who really had to push and struggle to get in the rooms with filmmakers he really wanted to work with and challenge expectations of his dramatic versatility, but now more or less is kind of taken for granted as, like, Cruise himself, another of America's big screen dads, someone who has just the right combination of a high level of physical and dramatic discipline, but also a great forward-facing affect of laid-back charm. F1, with Pitt taking up, honestly, one of the least demanding starring roles he's taken in years, seemingly because he himself is just genuinely this passionate about race car driving, and F1 specifically. It can't help but come off as not only living in the shadow of Top Gun Maverick, but as Pitt almost trying to see if he can parlay his public persona into the same kind of iconic status, a means by which to cement his dramatic legacy at a time when, let's face it, nobody is really casting leading men based on their dramatic versatility anymore. They want guys who, ironically, are exactly the sort of public image that Pitt spent practically the first decade of his career trying to subvert or run away from, which is pretty men's health models with effective charisma who are judged far more on things that have nothing to do with their acting versatility, but more with their performative versatility in the context of Hollywood's war of spectacles, like not just what kind of role you can inhabit, but like almost literally, can you get behind the wheel of a Formula One car and sell your competency as a driver in the same way that Tom Cruise is like, no, I really want to fly that jet. I'm not making this movie if I can't fly that jet. Obviously, Cruise and Pitt aren't as muscularly deformed as so many of the up-and-coming leading men seem expected to be, but there's no getting around that in the case of Cruise, he's probably patient zero in terms of setting honestly rather psychotic standards in terms of how much a leading man is supposed to simultaneously be such an ultra-disciplined example of classic American male fitness, while also being chill and laid back and accessible. And while it's one thing for a young kid like Pitt's co-star Idris to try to distinguish himself in this new regime of leading men standards, even if he doesn't particularly care, it's gotta be crazy being Brad Pitt and being in his early 60s, and like, the expectation is that if you want to keep being able to make the more personal and artsier projects you want to take risks on, you're not just going to have to, like, play a cliche heartthrob or wisecracking thief, but, like, suddenly they're sending you to train in martial arts so you can play an assassin in a Sandra Bullock rom-com. Like, What the hell have we done? At what point isn't this elder abuse? But all that's kind of getting too far out ahead of the fact that, as not only the star, but the producer on this film, someone who clearly wants to chase after the coattails of the sort of career Tom Cruise has traced for Hollywood's fitter, older leading men, Brad Pitt sucks in this movie. And it's not just that he sucks so much as he sucks so much as the star of his own production that he drags virtually everyone else down with him. It's not just that his performance feels phoned in, like he's simply confidently resting on his laurels, believing he knows exactly what he's doing. It's that it all just feels so phony. It's the sort of role that, like a comparable Tom Cruise star vehicle, kind of just takes for granted that whatever ascribed sense of a particular leading man's public persona will follow naturally into a certain role. Except Pitt's performance in this movie is so bland and wooden and unconvincing in its affectation of exactly Pitt's whole public persona as kind of Hollywood's most famous, laid-back, chill stoner dad, that you begin to wonder how we got to the point where that is even taken for granted as what Pitt's public persona, what his star power is, when what his performance in F1 brings into such stark clarity is that Pitt doesn't come off as particularly laid back or chill or even natural. And when he tries to play that, he comes off as a very stagey, awkward, and most importantly, even like creepily insincere guy. It's one thing to portray a character as brash or egoistic or overly self-confident. It's another when he just ends up coming off like a huge self-serving jackass that would explosively sabotage anybody's ability to even relate to him as a human being long before he's able to win them over to his style of doing things and show them the roadmap to their own glory. And despite an impressive supporting cast that includes Javier Bardem as the F1 owner, Pitt's former rival turned recruiter, as well as Kerry Condon as the team's technical director and Pitt's eventual love interest, all of these parts are not only dragged down by Pitt's shallow and unconvincing performance itself, but the very mechanics of the plot, how strained it feels with every instance of Pitt just immediately flipping the metaphorical bird in everyone's faces, and in the film's one botched attempt to subvert sports movie cliches, how consistently he up and makes everybody else look like a laughingstock on this long and probable road to finding some kind of civil, begrudging peace with him and what basically bears out to being this elemental superiority he has. There is a very Randian element to this movie. I mean, Top Gun Maverick is exactly the same. That's a very Randian objectivist movie, but F1 like even more so because it really hinges so much on Pitt being such an unrepentant, selfish prick, but it not being supposed to matter in the slightest because he gets points on the board. And that's the only motive. Beauty, success, the strongest survive. Nothing else matters. You could say that you can't blame Pitt for Aaron Kruger's screenplay, and I'm not about to say that Kruger's leaden prose itself isn't a huge problem with this drama. Like, he doesn't basically make a foregone conclusion of Pitt's own unconvincing performance with his own unconvincing writing. But in its own way, and knowing that Pitt as a film producer is not above throwing his weight around on certain projects, even if it means steamrolling over the visions of the writer and directors he's ostensibly supposed to be working with, not against, I don't think it's too much to conjecture that a big reason why F1 comes off the way that it does is because Pitt himself is behind the scenes leaning on his own former glory projects to set a template that just doesn't work in this new context. For Kruger and Kaczynski, that template is Top Gun and Top Gun 2, and yes, there is even a climactic, tragic turn in F1 that is clearly a retread of the tragic turn in the original Top Gun. But for Pitt, that template is clearly Moneyball, another movie all about an outsider to a major major sport who comes into a failing team and says to everyone in the room, no matter how unpopular it makes us, no matter how much it leads people to doubt us, our goal is not to just follow the old formulas. We're not just going to follow the old strategies and stats. We got to bend the stats in our favor. We got to put runners on bases. We got to put points on the board. What it all amounts to is 2.5 long, dragged out, pathetic hours of Pitt at the center of what is demonstrably a half-baked and in its own way even pretentious vanity project to chase after and cement a kind of elder statesman leading man status that for him, as opposed to Cruise, was always kind of just variety fluff of his being a laid-back southern heartthrob that was completely incongruous with the often dirtier, pricklier, edgier, and threatening roles that he actually played and became his forte. When he even tries to be like a podunk Tom Cruise, it becomes immediately obvious that what is taken for granted as one of his essential star vehicle talents is just a hollow shell, a vain and annoying imitation of that more laid-back and accessible hot bad boy archetype. I'm not about to say that there's nothing to get out of F1, again, as a boilerplate sports drama, especially because, yes, as an action director, Kaczynski is definitely skilled enough to inject exactly the kind of sense of stakes and dramatic impact into the film's crucial and quite effective racing scenes that is ultimately so bereft from any moment where the characters aren't in their cars going hundreds of miles an hour, which is, of course, the vast majority of the movie. But life is just too short for what F1 stands for as a gratuitous notch in the belt of a guy who, no matter how clearly healthy he is technically, is clearly too old to be portraying these kind of geriatric all-American heroes. Pitt's abs might still be toned, but whatever dramatic versatility or behind-the-scenes creative instincts he might have had to carry a project like this have clearly gotten soft around the midsection. I'm giving F1 a 2 out of 5. With that, I'm tapping out. Thank you so much for sticking through this video, and don't be a stranger to sounding off in the comments. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? Otherwise, please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the new movie Diary. I'm going to catch you guys next time.